All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. And the way that we're going to structure the remaining classes in the series is really going to be around what's called the foundation of all good qualities, a short lamrim text. And that text is on the event page. There's a link to it on the event page on the website. You can open it, download it if you'd like your own copy. So that is what we are going to use to structure the remaining classes, the remaining material. So I think we may have touched on the concept of the lamrim already. As I mentioned, the foundation of all good qualities is just the name of the text. It's actually the first line of the text. So it's kind of like an Emily Dickinson poem in that sense. I don't know. It doesn't have a separate title. It's called The Foundation of All Good Qualities. It was composed by Lama Tsongkhapa, who is the founder of the particular school of Tibetan Buddhism that our center is affiliated with, the Gelug tradition, Gelug tradition. And so he was a practitioner, a yogi, a monk, who lived in the 1300s and decided to package the teachings in a particular way that became known as the Gelug tradition. So he is the one who put together this particular text. This tradition, though, of the lamrim, or the stages of the path to enlightenment, began with Lama Atisha earlier. So there are lamrim traditions in all of the schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and they all originated with Lama Atisha, who wrote Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. And then as a way to make it easy for the Tibetans, because he had traveled from India to Tibet and composed this text, Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment, to make it easier, at least, for practitioners to have a way of getting a handle on all of the sutra material that the Buddha had produced over the course of his entire life, teaching and explaining various concepts. And one reason, I think, we may have mentioned one reason that it's challenging to do that on one's own is not only are there thousands and thousands of pages of material that was recited as an oral tradition for hundreds of years and eventually written down in both the Sanskrit canon and the Pali canon, but the material itself doesn't always present the same topic in the same way, because these were dialogues that the Buddha had with disciples of varying capacities. So the depth and the sophistication of his way of explaining something would vary depending upon what the practitioner was bringing with them into that interaction, which also makes it challenging to discern kind of the highest intent of the Buddha, because if you were to try to read all of the primary source material, you would get these contradictory views, or what seem like contradictory views. But luckily, great masters like Lama Atisha, like Lama Tsongkhapa, were able to do that analysis for us And through rigorous study and then debate and all of the processes that go into the creation of commentaries, we're able to actually provide a comprehensive and consistent body of knowledge that is much shorter than the original primary source material. In our tradition, the most definitive text is the Lamrim Chenmo, the great treatise on the stages of the path. That's hundreds and hundreds of pages. So Lama Tsongkhapa composed the foundation of all good qualities as a short Lamrim prayer, or you could say a glance meditation on the Lamrim. It does not itself explain any of the topics. It just introduces each of the topics in a stanza. So it's something that people will memorize and then perhaps recite every day as a way of refreshing their understanding of the Lamrim itself. That's, of course, supplemented by the study and the meditation on these much more detailed teachings, like the Great Treatise, or Lama Tsongkhapa also wrote the middle length Lamrim, which is smaller than the Great Treatise. The Great Treatise is 3 volumes, middle length is 1 volume. But the foundation of all good qualities is not intended to be what a person uses to actually, by itself, but we're going to fill in those details with additional ideas. But we're going to use this as a way of demonstrating a very, very broad level overview of the entire Lamrim, because the foundation of all good qualities does contain stanzas that cover all of the topics that you find explained in much more detail in these larger commentaries. Okay, is that clear? Any questions so far?
That seems, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep.
That seems to make sense. And from what I've seen, it looks like there are programs to study both the Lamrim and more in depth through FTMP.
Yeah. So the 2-year Discovering Buddhism program is also, because the Lamrim is essentially everything that the Buddha taught, and it's just presented in a particular way, but it covers all of the sutra material. So the 2-year Discovering Buddhism program is another way of giving each of the major topics a whole module, which is 6 weeks. Basically, it gives each of the modules basically its own 6-week, or I'm sorry, each of the major topics of the Lamrim are essentially being given their own kind of module or 6-week program, and we'll restart that in January. So I know that's a while, but of course you can join that at any time, and the prior classes have all been recorded on the YouTube channel. Then there is right now we are also going through Lamrim Year at the center, which is also based, of course, on the Lamrim. It's using the teachings of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche to provide a framework for understanding the Lamrim. So it's a little bit different approach. And there is a basic program class also that FPMT has, which is on the middle length Lamrim, and we'll be offering that, but not anytime soon. But it is available as a correspondence course through FPMT if you were interested. That's a more advanced presentation, or more detailed presentation, because it really, discovering Buddhism doesn't use a lot of primary source material. It's kind of more, it's a kind of more pre-digested material, whereas the basic program is really only using primary source material. So it's more philosophically sophisticated in that way.
Yeah.
Okay. So the lamrim, regardless of which text, is organized into what are called the three scopes. The small scope, the middle scope, and the great scope is how the lamrim, any lamrim text, is organized into these three scopes. And the scopes depend upon the intent or the motivation of the practitioner. What is the practitioner trying to accomplish by practicing that section of the lamrim? So the small scope, the motivation of the practitioner is to become someone who is more interested in good future rebirths than they are in what's happening for the remainder of this rebirth, this lifetime. So by that I mean they turn away from caring so much about wealth and property, accumulating wealth or property or status or good reputation or power or influence. And what they then instead care more about are creating the causes and the conditions for good future rebirths. So they kind of radically reorient themselves away from just caring about careers and, as I said, wealth and status and so on, and they become someone who's deeply spiritual, and their goal is to use this life to create those causes and conditions for good future rebirths. And then, so there's several different sections or individual contemplations in the lamrim that are directed at transforming a person's mind from a person who started out being very interested in wealth and status and power and so on, into someone whose focus primarily is in creating the causes and conditions for a good future rebirth. And then there's the middle scope of the lamrim. So, we can see how even just the small scope of the lamrim is a really profound reorientation of what a person's priorities are, what a person is interested in doing with their life and their time and their resources and so on. But then it is possible to refine that motivation, even though it's profoundly different than how most people are, than how we were before we were engaging with the small scope. You can go further, and when you go further, you practice the middle scope of the lamrim. And the middle scope of the lamrim recognizes that there is some value in good future rebirths, as was the primary motivation of the small scope practitioner, but they recognize that that value is limited to having the inner and outer conditions to complete their spiritual training, to avoid pitfalls on that path, and to avoid the things that would make it difficult or impossible to complete the training, the spiritual training that they're engaged in. But they don't see good future rebirths as having any value other than that. So before, a person was engaged in, you could say, a limited form of what's called renunciation, where they start to lose interest in doing the things that would help them to, or really, have high status, high wealth, good reputation. They lose interest in those sorts of things. However, and they instead replace that interest with being interested in practicing their spiritual path. However, they still look at good future rebirths as a kind of a good in and of itself. And that's kind of the extent of what they are doing, is they're just creating the causes and the conditions for good future rebirth. When you mature in your perspective and you see that the only value of good future rebirths is limited to being able to do whatever work isn't possible within a single lifetime, spiritually speaking, then you give up on just wanting the kind of enjoyment that can come with good future rebirths. And you recognize that there are no rebirths. When we say good, good is comparative to the kinds of rebirths where the greatest amount of suffering is present. It is not an absolute good, it is a comparative or relative good. And so a practitioner on the middle scope would recognize that there are no rebirths that are completely free of suffering, whether they're considered comparatively good or not. They are still conditioned by unsatisfactoriness. And so they would begin to strive not for good future rebirths because they've already created by mastering the small scope. They're not really worried about that. They're already doing all of the things. They've already integrated the small scope. So they're doing all of the right things that are going to create the causes and the conditions for good future rebirth. So now what they're really focused on more is putting an end to the process of rebirth. So they want good future rebirths, but only up to the point where they've completed the training that puts an end to the process of rebirth. And this is the attainment of lower nirvana that we've talked about before, the distinction between lower nirvana and full enlightenment. And so the Theravada tradition, the practitioners of the Theravada tradition, they stop at the middle scope. They practice those trainings. They don't specifically have the lamrim that, culturally speaking, is unique to Tibetan Buddhism, but they have the sutra material, and certainly they have commentaries that are unique to their tradition. The lamrim specifically is a historical movement that originated in India and then was carried into Tibet. So it's not technically shared with other traditions, but there are similar things. So the Theravada practitioner, that's the end point of their, what exists in their tradition, is putting an end to cyclic existence. So they certainly want to create those causes and those conditions to have sufficient lifetimes to carry out that practice, and then that's it. They accomplish that, and that's, for that practitioner, the end result of what they are training in. And then, but then there is, again, from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, within the lamrim, there's the great scope, which is unique to, we talked about the Mahayana tradition of the Northern Asian countries. The Mahayana tradition is what makes the Mahayana tradition unique is contained in the great scope of the lamrim. You don't find it in Theravadan practice, and it is what distinguishes Theravadan practice from Mahayana practice. So, the other Northern Asian countries, Japan, China, when it was, I don't know exactly how much practice. There's some, I think, Buddhist practice still in China. China, Japan, Nepal, Bhutan, these Northern Asian Buddhist countries. They have other ways of they rely on the sutras, they rely on maybe other commentaries, I'm not sure, but within the Tibetan tradition, it's really the section of the lamrim in the what's called the great scope, where you find the teachings that distinguish Mahayana from Theravada. So a Mahayana practitioner does engage with the small scope, and they do engage with the middle scope, but they call those practices, what they would say is they're engaging in the practices that are held in common with practitioners of the small scope, or held in common with practitioners of the middle scope. Because from the Mahayana perspective, the goal is to aspire to the great scope, to practice the great scope, because it's Tibetan Buddhism is part of the Mahayana tradition. So you want to progress to the great scope. You want to not stop at the small or middle scopes. So the small scope, the middle scope, and oh yes. Mm-hmm.
No. I was just thinking I probably won't understand till I hear a bit more about great scopes. I didn't want to stop with questions.
Yeah. So then the great scope, because the stated goal of the Theravadan tradition is lower nirvana, and the stated goal of the Mahayana tradition is full enlightenment. It's the practices that lead to full enlightenment that are contained in the great scope. That's primarily bodhicitta motivation and wisdom directly realizing the nature of reality. So because for a middle scope practitioner, for a Theravadan practitioner, they would focus on having a direct insight of the nature of reality on the middle scope, because there's nothing after that. For a great scope practitioner, a Mahayana practitioner, they would focus on renunciation in the middle scope, and then the having a direct insight into the nature of reality on the great scope, because they want to combine that with bodhicitta motivation, the wish to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. It seems to be the strength of that motivation that transforms the realization of the nature of reality into something that can lead to full enlightenment. Because if you have the direct perception of the nature of reality, but your view is you're just doing it for oneself, then that is what it will result in. If you are doing it with the view that you're doing it for the benefit of all sentient beings, then that seems to expand the result into being able to do that. And then there are practices in Tibetan Buddhism that are also part of you could say, that practice, that are not contained in the sutra path. They're contained in the Vajrayana tradition, that are still related to bodhicitta motivation and seeing the nature of reality directly, but also working with the energy, the subtle energy system of the body. And you don't find that contained in the sutra path. It's unique to the Vajrayana path, the Vajrayana tradition. So this way of organizing the Buddhist teachings are said to have four advantages or four qualities of the lamrim. One is that we talked about how you can see that there aren't contradictions in the sutra material when you understand that the teachings were given to various levels of disciples. Some of those disciples were practicing the small scope, some were ready to practice the middle scope, some were ready to practice the great scope. And so he gave various levels of teachings to different kinds of practitioners. Then the second is to recognize that everything that the Buddha taught is leading a person to enlightenment. And so there's nothing in the lamrim that was given just as an interesting statement, or like this is a factoid, or this is, something that's just intellectual knowledge. Everything in the lamrim is designed for one's own personal practice to transform a person in a step-by-step gradual way up through the point where they've achieved full enlightenment. So to look at every teaching that the Buddha gave as personal instruction for one's own spiritual journey. And then the third feature or quality is that we easily see what's called threefold division. The threefold division of the Buddha's teachings is contained both in those three scopes, the small scope, the middle scope, and the great scope, and also shown in the three realizations, the three principal aspects of the path, which is renunciation, bodhicitta, and emptiness, or the seeing the nature of reality directly. So I mentioned that in the small scope and the middle scope, even with the small scope, there's the giving up or the losing of interest in some things, some worldly things. So the path of renunciation really even begins at that point, and then it's kind of culminates or perfected in the middle scope, where you apply it to everything within ordinary cyclic existence, and you're only directed at nirvana. And then, as I mentioned, bodhicitta, the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, and then directly realizing the nature of reality or emptiness. So a person who's practicing the small, middle, and great scopes, what they're getting insight into are these three principal aspects: renunciation, bodhicitta, and the right view, or the direct view of the nature of reality. And then the fourth feature is that we abandon, we are protected from abandoning the Dharma, which means that we don't say, oh, I'm a Mahayana practitioner, so the small scope is for someone else, or that this is for a different person, a different tradition. We see how, even though we might aspire to the great scope, we actually have to engage in the small scope and then the middle scope in order to become qualified to practice the great scope. So we can't leave, if our goal is to achieve enlightenment, we can't leave any of these other contemplations out. We have to progress step by step by step through each level, and then it culminates in the great scope. It culminates in full enlightenment. But we don't criticize, the practices that are held in common with the small scope or the middle scope. We don't see them as inferior or for a different kind of practitioner. We just see them as preliminary to the great scope. All right, so we're ready now to start to look at the prayer. Any thoughts or questions?
I think I lost my question. I'm pretty tired, but it just how does one know, like knowing this information, how does one know that this is or isn't for them, that they aren't ready to delve into a committed path?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's no, I mean, at the beginning, I don't think that there's any reason to think of oneself in any particular way. I would say, at the beginning, to just take the teachings that seem interesting, um, and then if it starts to resonate, if it starts to make sense, and if you feel, a close connection with it, and that kind of motivation internally starts to be there, then I would just say I think it's a very natural process, and I think it should be a relatively slow process, where you're just kind of looking at it as information, kind of thinking about it in terms of hypotheses about, this assertion, that assertion, and testing it out. Does it make sense? Does it seem reasonable? Does it seem logical? What doubts arise? How do I clarify those doubts? Am I comfortable integrating this, or do I not feel comfortable integrating this? Why or why not? So it's a very kind of reflexive. It's not meant to just be accepted because it is written down somewhere. It's meant to be worked with and questioned, and so I would say, and I think it's, important to take teachings in different traditions at the beginning to see, what feels the best, what kind of approach does or doesn't resonate. Because, some people like Zen, some people don't like Zen, some people prefer this or that, or so I don't think that it's necessary to put labels on it, right away. I think it's better to just look at the different presentations and just go slowly, and it either will click or it won't, or, and then you can investigate how you're reacting to it and what your reactions are based on. And but in terms of if a person, because the lamrim, really engaging with the lamrim is a more advanced way of having a practice in Buddhism. A person could just kind of do meditations here or there on loving kindness or compassion, and that's not really the lamrim. There was the kind of that question. I don't, Geshe Zopa is here, and on Tuesday night, the Be Your Own Therapist, there was that question about, well, is it sufficient to just kind of understand generally the Four Noble Truths and like become a good-hearted person? And Geshe Zopa said, no. I mean, if you've decided that enlightenment is your goal, then you have to master the lamrim. You have to master each contemplation of the lamrim. But if you haven't decided that, if that's not where you are, then that's fine. There's no reason to be like, oh, Buddhism is only for people who've made that kind of decision. I think it just kind of organically, grows. And if it starts to make sense that, sensory experiences are not genuine happiness, and genuine happiness is the result of mental states, and they can be cultivated, and the things that um, act, to cover up or act in opposition to those mental states are things that can be reduced and eliminated. If kind of that whole process just starts to make sense and seem reasonable, and then I just think that people's interest deepens in a organic way over time. But I think it should, probably for most people take a couple of years, before they kind of really jump in, in a really committed way.
Thank you. That helps a lot. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll start with the first verse, and again, it's on the event page if you want to look at a copy. The first verse is: the foundation of all good qualities is the kind and venerable Guru. Correct devotion to him is the root of the path. By clearly seeing this and applying great effort, please bless me to rely upon him with great respect. So the foundation of all good qualities is the kind and venerable Guru. Correct devotion to him is the root of the path. By clearly seeing this and applying great effort, please bless me to rely upon him with great respect. So, of course, the word him, which is here, is a cultural anachronism, because this was written in the 1400s. So and at that time, there were essentially no female teachers. That is a fact that characterized the 1300s, 1400s in Tibet. Now, in 2023, there are many highly accomplished, perfectly reliable female gurus, female teachers, and so a person could have a male, and a person can have, of course, more than one teacher or guru. So that's not, it doesn't mean that one's teacher is male. Just at the time that the prayer was written, and in Buddhism, there's such a reverence for the historical texts, they won't rewrite them to be more, politically correct, or more to update them to keep in line with changes in culture and so on. They just won't do that. But we can understand that there's nothing meaningful about that terminology now. But what is meaningful is the concept of guru devotion that is being presented here. And and that's also something that Geshe Zopa is doing a series on. So that's probably the best source of information to have more detailed information on that. It is a huge topic in Buddhism, the relationship with one's teacher. So the idea, broadly speaking, is that there's only so much we can do if we're isolated and on our own, and we're looking at, we're just trying to learn from books, from videos, and we don't actually have someone that we can talk to, that we can ask questions from, that we can get feedback from in terms of how our own practice is going, that we're not getting guidance from, that we're not asking advice from. If that kind of relationship is not something that we ever develop, then we will have limitations in how far we can go, because it's sort of like an apprenticeship or a mentorship, that we we're trying to learn how to do something, but we're not doing it. We're not being led, we're not being guided, we're not receiving feedback. And that's a limitation if we never get to that stage. And again, that doesn't mean that we ought to rush into that. That's certainly also not skillful in many cases, to very, very quickly feel like we need to come under the guidance of a teacher, because that's a very serious um, relationship. To make that teacher student disciple teacher disciple relationship is a very strong karmic bond, and it's very serious, and we want to take that very seriously. And so, we want to check and make sure that it's that the person that we're coming under the influence of is a proper teacher, that they have the right qualities of a teacher. And so, and not to just follow someone because they're charismatic, or because they say the kind of nice things that we want to hear, and they don't challenge us. And so it's a very difficult topic, particularly for the Western mind. But there does come a point where we can only go so far by trying to learn through our own self-study, and never being able to receive guidance, never being able to receive feedback. So we do want, there's a real value that's placed on being able to do that. And so, of course, it says that really all of our, it says the foundation of all good qualities is the guru, which means, because even if we are relying on texts and so on, they were written by valid teachers. The living tradition of Buddhism over 2,600 years, it all came from, they might not be one's own guru, but they are valid teachers nonetheless. And so the entire corpus of material that we are even attempting to understand is coming from that tradition. So the extent to which we can use that to increase our wisdom, to increase our compassion, is coming from the insights of valid teachers. And then what our tradition would suggest is that the quality of our relationship with the person that we've chosen to reveal the path, to give us that guidance, give us that feedback, that advice, the quality of our relationship with that person plays an incredibly important role in our ability to actualize the path, to get the results of the path. And it's the sort of the foundation. And again, this is coming from the 1300s, 1400s in Tibet, where almost everyone was illiterate, and the teachings were scarce. So it isn't to say that this isn't true anymore. This is still very much a valid truth, but it is, I think, also fair to say that we can make progress before we feel that we're prepared to enter into a relationship with a teacher. It isn't that it's hopeless. It isn't that it's sort of all or nothing, that I will make no progress and I will accomplish nothing up until the moment where I feel like I found a teacher, where I found a personal relationship. And we can use people like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or other great masters that we feel a connection to. We can use them as who we're regarding as our teacher, up until the point where we have the ability to have a more personal, relationship with someone. So any thoughts about that? Questions?
That makes sense because it's more about a reflection, like you're really honoring or respecting kind of one's own insights, the insight to be able to discern when it's appropriate to have a teacher, as opposed to being like rushing into the supermarket and buying a whole series of things without really knowing what they are. Yeah. Thank you.
So then the second verse is understanding that the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once, is greatly meaningful, and is difficult to find again. Please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly day and night takes its essence. Understanding that the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once, is greatly meaningful, and is difficult to find again. Please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly, day and night, takes its essence. So here, even within the stanza, there's kind of what looks like a contradiction, where it says, the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once, but then it says, is difficult to find again. So both of those two statements, they can't be literally true. If something can only be found once, then it can't only be difficult to find again. But what this is referring to, which is why, we have to study the whole, there's a whole chapter on this topic, in the Lamrim Chenma, where that would, when you study the whole chapter, it becomes more clear what's meant. And then once you've studied it, then you use this to just refresh what you've studied. You use this glance meditation to kind of cause that all of your study, all of your insight to kind of be there in the mind that's kind of triggered by going through this prayer. But when Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is found only once, that's a reference essentially to a rebirth, and we'll look at this definition of precious freedom, or precious human rebirth, or perfect human rebirth, which is not just being human, but a human life that's qualified by 18 specific characteristics, which is, obviously then a subset of human. And what it's describing is the kind of human life that is the most well suited to making spiritual progress, to being free from obstacles that would delay or make difficult really incorporating the teachings into one's mind. So we'll look at those qualities. But when it says is found only once, what that really means is if a mind is experiencing, say like the lower realms, and where the suffering is quite high, and then that lifetime comes to an end, in order for all of the karmic causes and conditions to come together for not only a human rebirth, but a perfect human rebirth in that lifetime, in that sort of next life, that's so incredibly rare, it is as if it almost never happens. However, then when it says is difficult to find again, what that's referring to is now that we are in possession of a perfect human rebirth, it's much easier to use that life to create those karmic causes and conditions for a succession of additional perfect human rebirths going out into the future. So when you're coming from some other kind of rebirth where you didn't immediately generate those causes and conditions in your mind through practice, then the sort of spontaneous coming together of all of those causes and conditions is highly unlikely. But it becomes much more likely when you are in possession of such a thing and you can, you have the time and the space to put those causes and conditions together through your practice. Still, though, of course, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying it's not easy. It doesn't mean that it happens automatically. If we want another perfect human rebirth, if we want a succession of perfect human rebirths, we have to create those karmic causes and conditions. And it's certainly doable, but it does require intentional effort. It's not something that will happen by itself. And so understand, this it starts out saying understanding that all of the things, and then it says, please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly day and night takes its essence. So it is referring to our perfect human rebirth, and the essence of it is its opportunity that it's presenting to us to be able to create the causes and the conditions for a succession of additional perfect human rebirths. So to really extract that opportunity means to have a spiritual practice, to take it seriously, and every day to be trying to make progress in that direction. So Buddhism, Lama Tsongkhapa then is asserting that we actually do possess a perfect human rebirth right now. So we will look at those 18 qualities. They are distinguished by what are called the freedoms and the endowments, or the leisures and the the leisures and the endowments, or the freedoms and the richnesses. Different translations of the same thing. You could say leisures and freedoms, or you could say endowments and so on. But when we say freedoms, we mean negative things that we are free from. And when we say endowments or richnesses, we are talking about positive things that this lifetime is characterized by possessing or having. So there are detrimental, negative things that could be happening, but are not happening, and we are free from those, and those are the 8 freedoms. And then there are useful, beneficial things that are happening, and those are what we are endowed with, what are creating richness in our lives, and so on. So the 8 freedoms are 4 of the 8 freedoms are realms that our mind could presently in this life have taken rebirth into, but did not. And so these are non-human types of rebirth, meaning that the mind that we possess, our consciousness, when it was experiencing the end of the immediately preceding lifetime, the lifetime that preceded this lifetime, during that death process, that mind could have associated with a non-human form. And it has many, many times over beginningless previous lives, but because we have this life right now, that is not occurring. That did not occur, and presently, as long as this body and this mind remain associated, it's not happening for us. So there are three lower realms that fall under these non-human rebirths, and then there's here it's one upper realm, but that one upper realm can also be subdivided into two. But regardless, here it's talking about it as if it were one. So four kinds of realms where there are non-human beings. And so these are the animal realm, the hungry ghost realm, and the hell realm. In terms of the lower realms, hell is not my favorite translation of the word Narok, which is what is being translated as hell, because of all of the Judeo-Christian baggage that comes along with that translation, or that way of thinking about the word Narok, which just means the state of being unfree. But here we have that as what they've decided to use for that translation. It is the type of existence where the greatest amount of overt physical and mental distress are experienced by the kinds of beings who have taken rebirth there. Then you have what's called the hungry ghost realm, where the beings that take rebirth there are driven by hunger and thirst primarily, and that rebirth is characterized by a sort of consistent inability to slake hunger and thirst. So there's this kind of constant hunger and thirst, and an inability to do anything really about that. So it's a very tormented kind of experience. And then you have the animal realm, which we're familiar with. We have no access to those first two realms and no experience, no entry into that, but we are surrounded by animals, and so we know what that's like. That includes anything going down to like a fruit fly, up to, of course, mammals and whales and elephants, and so everything in between. His Holiness says that a sentient being is a being that possesses volitional movement, intentional movement. So if you observe an organism over a period of time, and if you can describe any and all movement that organism is engaging in as being due to a change in their environment solely, then the movement is not volitional and they're not a sentient being. Maybe they're a bacteria or a virus or something. They might be an organism, but they're not sentient. If sometimes they move and there was no real change in the environment, they just kind of decided to go in a particular direction, then that is evidence that there is mind, that there is consciousness. And even if it's a fruit fly, there is still consciousness, and so they are a sentient being. So those are the three lower realms, and they're called lower because there's, comparatively speaking, their existences are marked by a higher degree of physical and mental distress than a human experiences. And then there's the upper realm, as I mentioned, which again in English is referred to as the God realm. Again, not my favorite English translation because of, again, all of the Judeo-Christian baggage that comes with that. It is a realm where there's a lot of sensory enjoyment. It's kind of like a heavenly kind of realm. You know, if you were to look at descriptions of heaven and so on, it would be quite similar to that type of existence, but it's temporary. It just like a human rebirth is temporary, animal rebirth, all of these rebirths, they persist for a time, and then the body and mind separate, and that lifetime comes to an end. Um, but there's no advantage to this kind of heavenly rebirth because the beings in that realm are so distracted by their sensory enjoyment that they are not motivated to engage in practice. And so it's very, very difficult to use that type of existence to make spiritual practice. Just like in the lower realms, the opposite problem is what is happening. There's so much overt distress that's happening. The beings who are experiencing those realms cannot develop their minds. In the upper realm, they're also experiencing an obstacle to developing their minds, but that obstacle is the um, kind of the bliss that they're kind of just blissed out all of the time, and they see no need to engage in spiritual pursuits because they are not suffering in an overt way. And you need to see some disadvantages of your experience in order to be motivated to do something about your experience, and that kind of stimulus is absent from the upper realms. So you don't, from the Buddhist perspective, even though it's quite pleasant, it's not useful from a spiritual perspective, and so there's no reason to do it. Well, there's no reason for us to want that kind of life because we can't use it in a meaningful way. So that's why it's an obstacle that we should be glad that we're free from, because we would not be practicing in any of those four conditions. We would not be able to practice. Yeah, so those are the first of the four freedoms, the four negative things that we that could be happening to us that are not happening, and that it's beneficial that they're not happening. Then the next four freedoms are having been born at a time when a Buddha has not appeared in the world, and or times when the Buddha has not taught. So a Buddha has to come and a Buddha has to teach, and that those teachings still have to exist. And then the third is that we might have a body and mind that doesn't work sufficiently well for us to practice. We could be experiencing a coma. We could be in just great pain all of the time. We could have an injury to the brain, which might prevent the mind from being able to be expressed sufficiently to be able to hear the teachings and to make sense of the teachings. So there is a certain support in the body and mind that's necessary to be able to engage in the practice. And that's not guaranteed for the rest of our lives. We could be hit by a car, we could get Alzheimer's, dementia, we could get things could happen to the body and mind where practice would be very, very difficult. But at least right now, our body and minds work sufficiently well that we can read the teachings, understand the teachings, make sense of it, and engage in practice, which is necessary. And then the last of the the last of the eight freedoms, the last of the second set of four, is being free from what are called wrong views. So so wrong views is a kind of complicated subject, but basically it means just dismissing the teachings, being convinced that the teachings are wrong, and that it's not possible. So it doesn't mean that we have a questioning mind, that we're not sure, that we're still investigating. It means that we've made up our minds and we are closed off to the idea of the teachings even possibly being correct. From the Buddhist perspective, that would prevent a person from achieving enlightenment. That would be a very heavy obstacle if it were to happen. If a person said, it isn't that I'm not convinced yet, or that I need more information, or that I need to investigate, but in fact, I can just look at it and say definitively that it's all just nonsense. If a person held that view, then there's no real likelihood that they would pursue the path that leads to liberation. They might pursue some other path, but the Buddhist path is unique in its ability to lead to enlightenment. Just being a good person doesn't lead to enlightenment. Yeah. So those are the 8 freedoms, the 8 negative things that don't characterize our experience, that we are free from. Any questions about the 8 freedoms? No? All right. So now we have what are called the 10 endowments. So I mentioned that there are 18 qualities of a perfect human rebirth, the 8 freedoms, and the 10 endowments, or the 10 richnesses. So some of these are just the opposite of the negative thing that we are free from. They're kind of the flip side. So the first is that we are human. One of the richnesses was not being a non-human. One of the endowments is that we are in fact human. Then the next endowment is that we live in what's called a central land, which means that the teachings of the Buddha are present, they're not suppressed, they haven't died out. They're a living tradition that we can access in the place that we live in. So we can say that, potentially there are countries on earth that don't fall into that category. Like if you were in North Korea, probably be quite difficult to access this particular body of knowledge. If you lived in, Yemen or Somalia, or, some of these kind of failed states, again, it would be quite difficult to access that material. But we are free from that. Or even if, there was just a dictatorship that prohibited certain kinds of religious expression, that would be relevant. Okay. So then we're born at a time. So then, as I mentioned, a lot of these are just the flip side. So we're born at a time where the Buddha did appear. The Buddha did turn the wheel of Dharma, did teach. And again, so those are, and not only is that true, but we can access that. And then the next is not having committed any of the 5 what are called actions of immediate retribution, meaning that the karma of that action is so powerful that it's definite to ripen in our very next incarnation if it's not purified. Purification of negative karma is something that the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught that any negative karmic action can be purified from the mind, but if we don't purify it, then the Buddha also taught, we'll look at karma in more detail when we get to that section of the lamrim, but the Buddha taught that karmic seeds are never lost unless they are purified. And there are some actions that are considered to be so powerful karmically that we can say that they will ripen at the death of the lifetime in which they are created, whereas generally we can't say that about a karmic seed. We can say that a karmic seed will ripen in the future if it's not purified, if it's a negative karma, but generally we can't say when. With the 5 actions of immediate retribution, and retribution again is another word I don't like the English translation of because it makes it sound like there is an intelligence that is behind karma that's choosing to punish, and that's not the case. It just means that the karmic repercussion will not be delayed into the future, that the cause will immediately follow, or that the result will immediately follow the cause. There will be no delay in time because it's such a strong karmic cause. Okay. So those 5 actions are to kill one's biological mother, killing one's biological father, killing an arhat, which is someone who, a Hinayana practitioner who has a direct, who has a direct perception of the nature of reality and they've reached lower nirvana, or drawing blood from a Buddha. Meaning here it's a little bit esoteric in the phrasing. There's a sutra where there was a cousin of the Buddha, Devadatta, who was kind of the Buddha's nemesis, and Devadatta tried to kill the Buddha, but the Buddha, being omniscient, was able to avoid being killed because he could always predict what was going to happen, when it was going to happen. But there came a point where Devadatta kind of threw, kind of rolled a massive boulder down the side of a mountain where, next to where the Buddha was. And although the Buddha, saw that, that this was happening, and he was even able to kind of track all of the pieces of the shattering of this boulder because he got out of the way. There was one tiny sliver of this massive boulder because there were so many, I don't know, tens of thousands of shards. There was one tiny sliver, they say, that the Buddha wasn't able to dodge, and it drew a small line of blood in his flesh when it hit. But that was the worst thing that could happen to the Buddha, was that, you smash this massive boulder into tens of thousands of pieces, and all you succeeded in doing was, giving the Buddha a paper cut. But that did happen, and so if you do that, very, very heavy negative karma, and it doesn't refer to, a wheel turning Buddha like Shakyamuni Buddha, but just anyone who's achieved full enlightenment. So don't try to kill people who are fully enlightened is the takeaway. And since we don't know whether or not a person is fully enlightened, we probably should just try not to kill anyone, and we also don't know who is or isn't an arhat. So best to just never give rise to the intention to kill a human being of any kind. But very, very powerfully negative karma to kill an arhat or to attempt to kill a fully enlightened being. And then the last action of immediate retribution is to create a schism in a spiritual community. And a schism occurs when you kind of go into a functioning spiritual community and you cause it to not function. You kind of pit people against each other by spreading rumors or innuendo or whatever it is, and you kind of cause it to no longer function, and you kind of destroy a well-functioning spiritual community by maybe causing some people to doubt or to dislike each other, whatever it might be. So doing those are very, very heavy negative karmas that delay enlightenment for very, very long periods of time if they are done. So don't do them, is the idea. And of course, the assertion then is that we haven't done them in this lifetime. We've not killed one's father, one's mother. We've not killed a Buddha. We've not killed an arhat. We've not drawn the blood of a Buddha, etc. Because if we have done that, then we don't possess a perfect human rebirth, because the karmic implications of that are going to be strongly negative. Any thoughts about the 5 actions of immediate retribution? Or
I'm wondering, like a community that has had a lot of difficulty, where, I don't know, anything could happen, but let's say, leadership has come into question, and that comes apart because everyone starts questioning, is that somebody has created a schism, or that it's being reflected against standards of this culture as opposed to another culture?
I would say that a person would have to go into it like with the intent of bringing about a schism intentionally. So there are times when a person engages, like the head of a particular organization, like maybe they do something that people have a hard time with, and that causes them to lose faith in that person, and then they start like wondering about the organization in general. Things like that can happen. And I think that's different. I think that you kind of have to want to cause, you have to kind of be intentionally trying to interfere with a well-functioning organization. So, I would say it's probably good not to try to capitalize if a person is involved with an organization and there are issues, then maybe it's best to just maybe leave that organization if a person seems like it's not for oneself, but maybe better not to fan those flames, intentionally to make it worse than it otherwise would be, to kind of draw people away from it intentionally. But then of course the question becomes, is it a well-meaning intention because a person's concerned about harm that might come to someone? Then it gets more complicated. But in general, I would say, that the motivation would generally be kind of nefarious in some way, like you just you're just not, you don't like people, or you don't, you have some kind of agenda that's not positive in any way, that's bringing about this lack of functionality. Okay. Okay. Mhm. Did you have? Oh.
I just want to say thank you. So
So then the last of the personal endowments is kind of the opposite, again, of this idea of wrong views that we talked about before, where we said that a wrong view is like being certain in kind of a closed off way that the teachings can't possibly be true. Um, the opposite of that would be having some interest in pursuing the teachings, seeing some value, maybe not understanding all of the details, not, having full unshakable confidence in rebirth and, all of the things, but like genuinely being interested in looking at it as a valid path, and really wanting to learn more, to be open to it, to be receptive. um, yeah. So those are the 5 personal endowments. Of the 10 endowments, there are 5 personal endowments, and those are the 5 personal endowments. And then there are 5 kind of circumstantial or environmental endowments. So the 5 personal endowments are um, what we've covered, and those refer to one's own body and mind. The 5 circumstantial endowments are that you are born at a time when a Buddha has appeared, that the Buddha has taught, that the Dharma is flourishing, that there are followers of the teachings, and that there are supporters and benefactors of our activities in the Dharma, meaning that people have built places of learning, people have built monasteries, nunneries, dharma centers, people are producing books about Buddhism that we can read. And so these are things that depend on the actions of other people to some degree. It depends upon a Buddha having appeared and so on, and that there being followers of that. So these are kind of related to Buddhism being uh, a a living tradition in the world in general, the world outside of oneself. Um, and that's not really something that we have any control over. We do have control of, to some degree, um, the personal endowments. Um, but to some, and I say to some degree because we may not be able to leave. We may have been born in a country that's oppressive, and we may not be able to leave, but maybe we can. So So some of the richnesses or endowments refer to one's own body, one's own experience, and some of them depend upon the actions of completely other people, um, that we have no, at least, no control over whatsoever. So those are the 10 endowments, the 10 richnesses. So we have a body and mind that works well enough. We we live in a country where there's access to the teachings. We're born human. We haven't committed any of the 5 actions of immediate retribution. We have some interest in the teachings. We live in a time and place where the teachings of the Buddha are understood, they're widely practiced. There is some support for people who practice, meaning that they can go to monasteries, nunneries, etc. Yeah. So for all of those 10 things, for all of those 18 things, the 8 things, the 8 negative things that we are that we could be experiencing that would be an obstacle, we are free of those. And the 10 positive things that do characterize our existence, for all of those 18 qualities to come together simultaneously in a single human lifetime, is, karmically speaking, quite a feat. And we looked at how, if that comes together spontaneously without prior practice, then in the immediately preceding lifetime, then it's extraordinarily difficult, almost impossible. But once we are in possession of such a lifetime, we have a real opportunity to extract the essence of that and to use that lifetime to create this succession of good future rebirths, extending into the future, so that we can use that as an opportunity to, some people, because we're still on the small scope, so some Buddhist practitioners would use that to progress to the middle scope and achieve nirvana, lower nirvana. But from the Tibetan perspective, Tibetan Buddhist perspective, we would want to go all the way to the great scope, and not stop in the middle scope, not just achieve lower nirvana, but actually achieve full enlightenment. Yeah, but we'll stop there for today on Precious Human Rebirth, the second of the contemplations in the Foundation of All Good Qualities. Yeah, so we will pick this up again next week, where we'll just continue on with the Foundation of All Good Qualities, with the lamrim, and understanding all of the additional stanzas. All right. Well, thank you for coming, and I'll see you next week.